On September 12, 1683, it was daybreak. Vienna's walls were in ruins. For 2 months, the city had been under siege. Inside the broken walls, the weary defenders looked out to sea with a mix of hope and despair. The Ottoman Empire's biggest force ever gathered in Europe, on the other hand, readied itself for the decisive attack. 200,000 heavily armed men, cannons that had destroyed the city's defenses, and the will to ultimately take control of the gem of Central Europe. Kar Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier, was sure. It appeared like victory was inevitable. However, a moment that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of European history was about to occur. There was a hidden weapon on the way, a force so strong and destructive that it would ruin what ought to have been the greatest Ottoman triumph and make it one of the most disastrous losses any empire had ever experienced. This is how the Battle of Vienna came to be. More than that, though, this is the tale of how, in a matter of hours, a single military force altered the course of entire civilizations. Get ready to learn about the covert weapon that ultimately put an end to Ottoman aspirations and saved Europe. Before we go any further, please leave a comment stating when you saw this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any further military history films. All right, let's return to 1683. We must travel back a few decades to completely comprehend what transpired in Vienna. This was when the Ottoman Empire was at its most powerful. The Ottomans had grown in all directions since the fall of Constantinople in 1453. They had deepened their penetration into Central Europe and ruled over the Balkans, North Africa, and the Middle East. Conquering Vienna was a desire of every sultan. The city is regarded as the gateway to Western Europe. Nothing would stop the Ottomans from advancing on Germany, France, and other countries if Vienna fell. The Habsburg Empire, which ruled over Austria and a large portion of Central Europe, was in dire straits. Threats to Emperor Leopold came from all directions. The Habsburgs' western boundaries were continuously under pressure by the French under Louis XIV, Sun King. Protestants in northern Germany harbored mistrust towards the Catholic Austrian ruler, while Ottoman influence expanded steadily to the south and east. The situation deteriorated in 1681. The Ottomans had the perfect justification to intervene when a Hungarian uprising against Habsburg control occurred. At last, Sultan Mehmed IV decided to take over Vienna. He put Kar Mustafa Pasha, his aspiring Grand Vizier, in charge of the campaign. Karam Mustafa was obsessed with fame and fortune. He viewed the conquest of Vienna as an opportunity to gather unthinkable riches in addition to a military triumph. He began putting together the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever sent into battle. The call was answered by 200,000 men. The heart of the imperial army was made up of the highly skilled and fervent Ottoman infantry, known as the Janissaries. Armed with lances, sabers, and composite bows, the Sipakis were heavy cavalry fighters atop exquisite Arabian horses. Units from Crimea, Tartar vassals renowned for their fierceness, were also there. The horde joined the regiments from Transylvania, Mulvia, and Wallachia. Tens of thousands of adventurers, raiders, and irregular infantry also followed the army in search of glory and loot. But the army's weapons were really what made it terrifying. Gunpowder cannons were first used in Europe by the Ottomans. They carried 300 pieces of weaponry, including massive bombards that could fire hundreds of kilograms of stone projectiles. 2 centuries before, the walls of Constantinople had been destroyed by these cannons. Vienna would now be their target. The march of this enormous army began in the spring of 1683. Fear swept over Central Europe as word of its arrival spread. City after city gave up without a struggle. Those who objected were lifted to the floor. Everything in its path was destroyed as the Ottoman army swept forward like an unrelenting flood. They arrived at Vienna's gates in July. Just 15,000 people, a combination of volunteers, urban militias, and imperial soldiers, defended the city. The odds of winning against 200,000 invaders appeared to be 0. Count Ernst Rütiger von Starnberg, a seasoned and resolute soldier, took leadership after Emperor Leopold left the city. Starnberg was aware that waiting for reinforcements to arrive was his only chance. However, from where would these reinforcements originate? Rivals in politics and religion caused Europe to become split. It would be extremely difficult to persuade the princes of Germany, Poland, and Italy to band together against their shared foe. One man, however, was adamant in doing precisely that. Pope Innocent XI viewed the siege of Vienna as much a holy war as a political catastrophe. He dispatched emissaries to every court in Catholic Europe as part of a desperate diplomatic effort. He maintained that all of Christendom would be in jeopardy if Vienna fell. He offered any ruler who would help the besieged city cash, religious dispensations, and his moral support. His message gradually gained traction. John Sobieski, the Polish king, was the first to reply. Having fought the Ottomans in the Ukrainian steppes all of his life, Sobie was one of the finest military leaders of his era. He knew Ottoman strategies, comprehended their mindset, and, above all, was not scared of them. When Vienna called for assistance, Sobie saw a chance to not only defend Christendom, but also to bring honor to Poland. The hidden weapon started to take shape as soon as he started to organize his army. In terms of quantity and quality, no other European army had what the Polish army did. The Winged Hussars, heavy cavalry. The fighters in these regiments were the elite of the elite, having developed over centuries of continuous conflict on the eastern frontiers of Europe. Each Winged Hussar belonged to the Szlachta, a warrior elite, and was a Polish nobleman. They were trained in the techniques of war from an early age. Before they could walk, they learned to ride, and before they could write, they learned how to use a lance. A Winged Hussar was a mounted, murderous machine by the age of 20. But the Hussars' equipment was what really set them apart. Each knight was fully armored in a lighter Eastern kind of armor composed of overlapping steel plates which provided superior protection without compromising mobility, as opposed to the bulky Gothic armor worn by medieval knights. They donned tiger or leopard skins over the armor, not for display, but because it was believed that the skins provided more protection against arrows and sabers. Wings were affixed to a special structure on their backs. large wooden constructions covered with eagle feathers. When the knight galloped, it created a frightful sound. This psychological sound was designed to demoralize the enemy even before impact. The primary weapon of the winged hussar was the kopia, a 6-meter-long hollow wooden lance. The kopia was balanced in the hand, allowing the rider to use it more as a thrusting stick than a shock lance, in contrast to Western European lances which were held securely under the arm. This method allowed the hussar to push the lance through several adversaries in one charge, pull it back, and use it again. When the lance broke, the hussar pulled out one of his many sabers, swords with razor-sharp curves that could cut off a limb with a single strike. But the hussars' true power was not limited to their equipment or personal training. It was in their strategy and discipline. The hussars attacked in close formation, knee to knee, in waves. In contrast to the majority of cavalry at the time, which rushed in disorganized formations. After the formation was broken by the first line's hammer-like blow to the enemy, the second line moved through, taking advantage of the opening, followed by the third line. The fourth, too. Entire armies could be destroyed in a matter of minutes by this expertly designed death machine. Of course, the hussars were known to the Ottomans. Although they had previously encountered Polish cavalry, they had never witnessed the full force of the winged hussars as they charged in their numbers across flawless terrain down the mountain. They were unaware of what was about to happen. The situation in Vienna was getting serious as Sobieski was gathering his army in Poland. The city was continuously assaulted by Ottoman artillery. Parts of the walls had fallen away. In order to create openings that their forces attempted to take advantage of, the Ottomans excavated tunnels beneath the defenses, loaded them with explosives, and detonated them. In the ruins of the fortifications, there were violent hand-to-hand battles and assaults every day. Each onslaught was repulsed by the defenders, but at a tremendous cost. The number of casualties increased, the ammunition ran out, there was hardly much food left. Both soldiers and civilians were dying of malnutrition and illness within the city. While some suggested surrender, Starrenberg remained steadfast. He knew there would be assistance soon. All he had to do was wait a bit longer. He ascended the deteriorating walls every night and peered west for any indications of a relief army. And each night he saw nothing but darkness and the Ottoman camp's fires extending as far as his eyes could reach. Kara Mustafa was getting impatient to cross the lines. He had not anticipated how long the siege would last. He had anticipated that Vienna would fall in a matter of weeks. Months had now gone by. His guys were becoming agitated. There were incoming reports of the formation of a relief army in the north. Karam Mustafa, however, was sure. He had 200,000 men. He could simply split his forces, keeping half to carry on the siege and employing the other half to kill the rescue forces, even if a relief army showed up. But he had made a critical error. He was totally unprepared for the magnitude and makeup of the troops advancing on Vienna. John Sobieski wasn't arriving by himself. Princes had sent contingents from all throughout Germany in response to the Pope's calls. An imperial army was brought by Charles V, Duke of Lorraine. Saxony's John George III dispatched troops.
Bavarian regiments accompanied Maximilian II Emmanuel of Bavaria. German principalities, including smaller ones, sent all they could. These forces had assembled in the hills to the north of Vienna by the beginning of September. Despite having fewer than half the Ottoman force's strength, about 70,000 men, the rescue army was unified by a shared goal and commanded by one of Europe's finest leaders. The rescue army started its last advance on Vienna on September 8th. They passed through the rocky, wooded Vienna heights, which made movement difficult and slow. The Ottomans knew their approach, but they were unable to determine their precise location or strength because of the terrain. It was Khurram Mustafa's second pivotal error. He made the decision to divide his forces precisely as he had intended, rather than relieving the siege and putting his army in a solid defensive posture. He deployed merely a blocking force to deal with the rescue army, keeping the majority of his army busy with the siege. There were skirmishes in the hills for the next few days. The rescue army's advance was consistently thwarted by Ottoman advance units that attempted to stop it down. The rescue army moved out of the woods and positioned itself on the heights north of Vienna on September 11th. The two armies were able to view one another for the first time. Confusion and anxiety prevailed on the Ottoman side. The Polish Hussars' armor and wings shone in the midday sun on the right flank of the rescue force, which was larger than expected. Sobieski looked at the battlefield like a professional. His hidden weapon was fully favored by the terrain. The landscape descended in a long, somewhat gradual slope toward the Ottoman lines from his vantage point on Kahlenberg Hill.
The terrain was ideal for cavalry. Gravity would give the charge tremendous force, allowing him to launch his hussars down the hill at maximum speed. With their backs to the Danube River, the Ottomans were positioned on the lowland. They wouldn't have anywhere to go if their line broke. The tactical situation was perfect. At dawn, Sobieski ordered the attack. It was a difficult night, September 11th, 12th. Both sides were aware that Vienna's fate, and possibly that of all of Europe, would be determined the next day. Priests blessed the soldiers and heard confessions along Christian lines. Prayers were led by imams on the Ottoman lines. Now Kha Mustafa was concerned. Although he had misjudged the opposition, it was too late to alter his approach. He gave his men instructions to be ready for the assault. On September 12th, a chilly and misty dawn broke. The relief force started to move down from the hills at first dawn. In infantry and cavalry formations, the Germans and Austrians occupied the middle and left. Still on the right were the Poles. Soys held his back, awaiting the ideal opportunity. Artillery exchanges commenced the engagement at 8 a.m. To counter the new threat, the Ottoman guns that had been positioned to bombard Vienna had to be swiftly moved, but many of them were set in place and could not be moved in time. Stimberg, meantime, heard the artillery to the north and realized what was going on inside Vienna. Assistance had come. In order to stop Mustafa from sending reinforcements to face the rescue army, he gave his forces the order to sort things out and attacked the Ottoman lines from inside the city. The battle grew more intense during the day. The Ottoman lines clashed with German and Austrian soldiers. The Janissaries defended their positions while fighting valiantly. The result was unknown for hours. The center of Ottoman rule was holding. They could regroup and battle again the following day if they could wait until nightfall, but Soyuz was waiting. Observing the conflict from above, he determined when to use his covert weapon. He found what he was looking for at about 3 in the afternoon. The Ottoman corps has thrown itself into it. The Ottoman left flank, the portion of the army directly beneath the Polish position, was starting to crumble under the strain, and their reserves had been committed. The time had come. The order came from Soyuz. 18,000 wings kept their horses in the house. Regiment after regiment, they lined up in rows more than a mile wide. Soyuz inspected his guys as he rode along the formation. Then he moved to the front of the first line. The charge would be personally led by the Polish king. He brought his sword up. The wind rustled the hussar's wings before he dropped it and gestured to the enemy below. 18,000 horsemen started to move, initially walking, then trotting, and then galloping as the incline became steeper. Under 60,000 hooves the ground trembled. A roar of wings like a storm coming down from the hills. An avalanche of steel and rage descended upon the Ottomans on the left flank as they glanced skyward. Those who stayed suffered hell on earth, while many just broke and ran away before the hit. Like a rocket, the first line of hussars hit the Ottoman lines. In a single push, 6-meter lances penetrated shields, armor, bodies, and several warriors. Infantry were trampled by horses, sabers flashed, limbs and skulls severed. The second line of hussars then raced past the first, enlarging the distance before the Ottomans could respond, followed by the third and fourth. The whole Ottoman left flank was destroyed in a matter of minutes. The hussars continued. Wheeling inward, they continued their assault on the Ottoman center from behind. Throughout the Ottoman lines, panic broke out. Suddenly, units which had battled valiantly throughout the day were under attack from the front, sides, and rear. The center broke. Ottoman soldiers fled in all directions, but there was nowhere to go. The Danube lay behind them. Like reapers through wheat, the hussars rode through it. The battle descended into carnage.
Karam Mustafa made an unsuccessful attempt to rearrange his forces. There was complete terror among his army. He gave the order to retire, but it was too late. The Sipahis and Janissaries, his finest regiments, were encircled and decimated. They took his cannons. Christian warriors seeking retribution and loot overran his camp, which was stocked with the loot he had stolen during his march through Hungary. The Ottoman army was no longer a fighting force by nightfall. At least 15,000 of the 200,000 soldiers who had surrounded Vienna lost their lives in combat. The subsequent pursuit claimed the lives of tens of thousands more. The others were dispersed and frantically escaped back to Hungary. Less than 2,000 men had been lost by the relief army. It was among the most comprehensive and resounding triumphs in military history. The residents of Vienna, who had resisted for 2 months, came out of the wall's rubble and sobbed joyfully. The city was spared, Europe was spared, and all because of a cavalry charge, a covert weapon that had completely annihilated the biggest army ever gathered by the Ottoman Empire. The tale doesn't stop there, though. For centuries, the effects of the Battle of Vienna were felt. It was the start of the end for the Ottoman Empire. The damage was done, but Karam Mustafa fled back to Constantinople and was murdered on the Sultan's orders for his failure. It had demolished the idea of Ottoman invincibility. After launching a counteroffensive in the ensuing years, the Habsburgs and their allies retook all of Hungary and drove the Ottomans back into the Balkans. Central Europe would never again be under grave danger from the Ottoman Empire. It was a moment of great glory for Poland. John Sobieski rose to fame as a hero across the Christian world. He was referred to as the savior of civilization by Pope Innocent XI. Ironically, though, this glory did not last long. Despite spending a great deal of money on the Vienna operation, Poland didn't gain any territory. Poland would be progressively torn apart by its neighbors in the ensuing decades due to internal strife, and it would vanish off the map for over a century. Vienna was the swan song of the soaring hussars. The charge on September 12, 1683, was one of the last massive cavalry charges in history, but it was also the biggest and most successful. The world was changing. The effectiveness of firearms was increasing. Infantry tactics were changing. Heavy cavalry would no longer be a deciding force on the battlefield in a few decades. As a remembrance of a more cruel and valiant era, the Winged Hussars would eventually vanish and become a legend. But they became a legend. Stories about the charge of Vienna were repeated for generations later. The avalanche of winged horsemen descending from the hills was portrayed in paintings. They composed tunes and wrote poems. The charge came to represent courage, tenacity, and victory against insurmountable obstacles. Furthermore, the Battle of Vienna has lessons that go beyond its particular historical setting. In the face of a shared peril, the combat proved the strength of unity. In 1683, Europe was sharply split. For more than a century, Catholics and Protestants had been engaged in bloody religious conflicts. German princes were always at war with one another. The Habsburgs and France were fierce rivals. However, these distinctions were momentarily abandoned in the face of the Ottoman menace. Together, Poles, Germans, Austrians, and Italians accomplished what none of them could have done on their own. The significance of leadership was also illustrated during the struggle. A great leader, John Sobieski, asked his subjects to do nothing that he wouldn't do himself. Leading the cavalry charge himself, he risked his life just as much as the most unassuming trooper. Leadership by example, such as this, is uncommon and valuable. No amount of command or oratory can compare to the courage and loyalty it inspires. Additionally, the conflict proved how important military tactics and technology are. The winged soldiers weren't your typical cavalry.
They were the outcome of centuries of rigorous training, tactical improvement, and military growth. They were a highly specialized weapon made for a particular purpose, and they were very destructive when employed by a commander who knew how to use them in the right terrain at the right time. Even though Kha Mustafa possessed a larger force, Sobieski knew just how to employ the right tool for the job. Vienna's most important lesson, however, may have to do with historical turning points. Sometimes the choices made by a small group of people in a short amount of time determine the fate of entire civilizations. History would have been entirely different if Sobieski had not responded to the cry for assistance, if the German princes had not set aside their disagreements, and if Starberg had given up even a few days sooner. It would have brought down Vienna. Central Europe would have been firmly under the Ottoman Empire's dominion. There would have been a significant change in the power dynamics. Who knows how things may have turned out in Europe and the world today? But these choices were made. These men stepped up to take on the task. And history took a different turn one September afternoon on a mountain outside of Vienna. Not due to intangible historical forces or economic trends, but rather to tangible human decisions and the courage of men who were prepared to risk all for their convictions. It's hard to believe that Vienna, a beautiful city with Baroque castles and quaint cafes, was the scene of one of the most tragic conflicts in history. The Ringstrasse, the broad boulevard that encircles the city's historic core, has long since replaced the walls that Starberg so vehemently defended. But remnants of those dreadful times can still be found if you know where to look. The places of the former walls are marked by plaques, monuments, Ottoman guns, hussar armor, swords and flags, as well as items from the conflict, can be found in museums. A church honoring the battle is located on Kullenberg Hill, the site of Sobies and his hussars' heroic charge. You can see the entire battlefield sprawled out below you from its terrace. The charge's route from the hill's summit to the plains below can be followed. And you can practically hear the roar of wings, the thunder of hooves, and the clash of steel on steel. Unexpected cultural repercussions of the Battle of Vienna also endure today. Among the booty, the triumphant Christians discovered an odd item as they invaded the deserted Ottoman garrison: coffee beans in bags and sacks. Coffee, a beverage that was still mostly unknown in Europe at the time, was consumed in large quantities by the Ottomans. As part of his compensation for being a messenger during the siege, Jerzy Franceski Kulczycki, a shrewd Polish businessman, seized some of these sacks. He opened the first coffee shop in Vienna using the coffee. The business was successful. Coffee shops quickly appeared throughout the city. The ruins of the Ottoman defeat gave rise to the Vietnamese coffee culture, which would go on to become well known throughout the world. The origins of the croissant also is the subject of a fascinating, if probably mythical, narrative. The crescent-shaped bread, the Ottoman symbol to celebrate the victory over the invaders, is supposed to have been made by Vienna bakers who worked at night and were the first to hear the Ottomans constructing tunnels beneath the walls.
Whether accurate or not, the story conveys the extent to which the conflict influenced European culture. But let's return to the actual secret weapon. Why were the Winged Hussars so effective? Though both were crucial, it wasn't only their amazing gear or excellent training. A perfect fusion of tactical, psychological, and technological factors came together. The Hussars' appearance was designed to frighten people psychologically. An almost otherworldly appearance was created by the wings, the animal hides, and the sheen of their armor. The sensation was tremendous when thousands of them charged simultaneously. Often enemy soldiers broke and ran away, even before to impact. Not because they were cowards, but because the sight and sound of this impending avalanche were too much for their brains to handle.
As a kind of psychological warfare, it was very successful. The Hussars were the ultimate development of shock cavalry from a tactical standpoint. The basic issue that had always restricted cavalry had been resolved. After the initial charge, what should be done? Conventional cavalry charged, dealt damage, and then frequently found themselves ensnared in close quarters, losing their mobility and being exposed. The Hussars were able to keep up their momentum thanks to their long lances and multi-wave strategy. They would wave through enemy lines, regroup, and charge once more. They may keep doing this, destroying a fresh portion of the enemy force with every charge. They were the ideal combination of mobility and protection in terms of technology. Their oriental armor was light enough to avoid wearing out their horses, while still being robust enough to repel most attacks. Their lances were hollow enough to be used with one hand, but long enough to reach the enemy before they could reach them. Their horses could carry the weight of a fully armed knight at top speed over long distances, because they were properly bred and trained. There was one last element, which was possibly the most important of all. The Hussars were experts. Each had been trained as a career warrior since they were young. They trained together, fought together, and instinctively understood one another's commands and moves. A group of riders became a potent military weapon because of their ability to function as a cohesive unit rather than as thousands of individuals. This is comparable to a large portion of the Ottoman army at Vienna. Although the Janissaries were elite soldiers with extensive training, the majority of the army was made up of adventurers, irregular troops, and regional levies. Although they were many and courageous, they lacked the Hussars' discipline and unity. They merely lacked the command structure and training necessary to react appropriately when the Polish formation arrived at their lines. The part that the geography plays in the conflict is equally interesting. Therefore, he carefully considered his attack site. The cavalry was able to increase their speed to its fullest because Kallenberg Hill provided the ideal long, gentle incline. The horses would have lost control if the terrain had been more steep. They wouldn't have accelerated enough if it had been flat. The formation would have dispersed if it had been uneven or obstructed. But the terrain was perfect, almost as if it had been planned for a charge of cavalry. According to some historians, Sobieski was lucky because he couldn't have predicted how advantageous the terrain would be. But this undervalues his brilliance as a leader. He had studied maps, talked to local guides, and scouted the area for days. He purposely positioned his army to capitalize on the terrain he knew he wanted it to be on. This was no accident. It was a very clever tactic. The significance of time in military operations is further demonstrated by the battle. For hours as the conflict raged, Sobieski kept his hussars in reserve. Sobieski waited until it was just right. Whereas many commanders would have become irritated and committed them sooner, he waited for the opponent flank to be weakened, for the Ottoman reserves to be committed, and for the sun to be in the proper position to blind the Ottoman defenders as they gazed upward towards the oncoming charge. Each and every aspect was calculated. Then he launched his secret weapon with catastrophic results. Eyewitness reports of the charge are intriguing. In the middle of the line, an Austrian officer reported seeing the whole slope shift, as if the mountain was descending upon the Ottomans. He claimed that the thunder of hooves was deafening, but the peculiar musical whistling of hussar wings created an eerie symphony. According to another German soldier's report, the hussars appeared to fly rather than dig, moving so quickly that it was difficult to follow with the naked eye. According to surviving sources, the Ottoman side was utterly terrified. The hussars were characterized as riding devils sent to punish the faithful by a Turkish chronicler.
No amount of courage could endure such an onslaught, he said, comparing it to attempting to remain steady in the face of an avalanche or earthquake. An other Ottoman narrative attributes the defeat to witchcraft, asserting that the Poles must have employed black magic to provide their horses with superhuman power and speed. They were more than just superstitions. They represented the psychological effects of encountering a charge of cavalry in large numbers. The primal fear of a cavalry charge is hard for modern humans to understand in an era of mechanized combat. Imagine being in an infantry formation with a sword, lance, or musket that you could fire once every minute. Thousands of armored horsemen are racing at you at 40 or 50 kilometers per hour as you look up. The earth trembles. The sound of thunder and dust fill the air. In a matter of seconds, they are upon you. There is just time to respond. There is no time to think. Furthermore, millions of years of evolution have ingrained in our brains the natural response to run from dangers that are bigger and stronger than ourselves. The hussars took advantage of this inclination. To elicit that instinctive terror response, they made the most of every element of their attack and appearance. And after decades of campaigning, it consistently worked. The psychological fear they evoked was so powerful that it broke larger armies. However, it's crucial to remember that the hussars weren't unbeatable. Poor topography, particularly marshy or highly forested places, was a problem for them. When faced with well-prepared defenses and disciplined men, they lost the upper hand. Even affluent Poland could only support a small number of them because they were costly to keep and train, and they could be driven back with great fatalities. Vienna marked the height of hussar power precisely because all the conditions were ideal: superb leadership, an enemy in a bad position, and excellent terrain. It's interesting to think about how the war would have gone if any of the crucial elements had been different. What if, on hearing about the impending arrival of a relief force, Kara Mustafa had decided to raise the siege? He would have had time to select a solid defensive position, possibly one where the topography would have neutralized the Polish cavalry's advantage, rather than attempting to battle on two fronts. What if he had repelled the charge with his guns more successfully? The Polish formation might have been destroyed by grape-shot-loaded cannons. What if the weather had changed and it had started to rain, muddying the ground and slowing the horses down? The result may have been entirely different due to any of these circumstances. But history isn't about possibilities. It addresses the actual events. And in a single afternoon, on September 12, 1683, 18,000 Polish knights altered the parse of European history. The military repercussions were severe right away. Along with losing an army, the Ottoman Empire also lost its reputation. The Ottomans had been dreaded for generations as almost unbeatable fighters.
European nations that had honored the Ottomans for decades suddenly discovered the strength to rebel after that aura was destroyed. The loss spurred military reforms and political upheaval within the empire itself. Due in part to their failure to stop the Hussars, the Janissaries started to lose their privileged status. The triumph marked the beginning of a golden age for the Habsburgs. They were able to consolidate their hold on Central Europe after the Ottoman threat was eliminated. They became one of Europe's superpowers after retaking Hungary and pushing into the Balkans. Once a border city under continual assault, Vienna rose to become the dazzling center of a vast empire. Much of Vienna's stunning Baroque architecture, for which it is now renowned, was built in the century after the conflict with funds from the newly captured lands. The conflict affected European diplomacy as well. It proved that European powers could set aside their differences and work together to combat a common threat if they were sufficiently determined. This precedent would be remembered in future crises, setting the idea that Europe as a whole had an interest in maintaining a balance of power and that no single state should be permitted to become dominant.
However, the outcomes were not entirely consistent from a Polish point of view. Poland as a state did not gain proportionately, even though Sobieski achieved immortal renown. Due to internal structural issues, particularly its distinct political structure that allowed each noble to veto any law, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was already in decline. Reform or decisive action was practically impossible under this regime. Poland remained divided in the decades following Vienna, as its neighbors, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, consolidated and modernized. These same neighbors, who had fought with Poland at Vienna, would eventually split it up among themselves, eradicating Poland off the map for more than a century. This is tragically ironic. Poland was unable to be spared by the same weapon that saved Europe in Vienna. This exemplifies a challenging reality regarding military might. Without a solid political and economic foundation, even the most powerful military forces are ineffective. Although they were able to prevail in combat, Winged Hussars were unable to address the fundamental issues facing Polish society. From ancient Rome to numerous contemporary empires, this lesson has been repeated throughout history. Another turning point in military history is the Battle of Vienna. It was one of the last instances that heavy cavalry played a decisive role in a major European conflict. Infantry with better muskets, more potent artillery, and ultimately trench warfare and linear formations were the way of the future. The days of knights galloping across the sky were over. Cavalry would mostly be used for pursuit and reconnaissance within a century. In a way, the charge of Vienna was the final chapter in an ancient style of warfare. However, it was hurrah! Seldom has a single military action had such immediate and dramatic repercussions in history. Millions of people's lives were changed in a few hours. Whole areas were transferred. The power dynamics between civilizations changed, and all because a monarch knew exactly when and how to wield the proper weapon, had the vision to rescue a city under siege, and carried it with him. The tale of Vienna has a profoundly inspirational and human quality. It wasn't a given. It wasn't predestined. It necessitated deliberate choices from those in leadership roles. Thousands of regular soldiers had to have the courage to put their lives at danger. People who had a lot of reasons to distrust one another had to work together. And it also called for a tactical genius that can only be developed by years of training and experience. More than 3 centuries later, there are lessons to be learned from the Battle of Vienna that go beyond its particular historical setting. We study the importance of topography, timing, specialty, and preparation in military operations. We study the influence of motivating leadership and setting a good example. We discover the importance of teamwork when confronted with shared challenges. And we also discovered that the decisions and deeds of real people, not impersonal forces, shape history. Not simply a particular type of horse or item of equipment was the hidden weapon that decimated the Ottoman army. At the ideal time, a confluence of tactical, strategic, technological, and human elements came together. It was the result of centuries of military evolution, honed by innumerable conflicts, and used by a skilled strategist who knew just how to use the available weapon. In Vienna, John Sobieski's Winged Hussars destroyed more than simply an army. They put an end to the centuries-long Ottoman expansionist campaign. In addition to saving a city, they also preserved a culture. On a bright September afternoon, they rode down the hill in immortal splendor, their wings singing a song of victory that would reverberate through the ages, changing the course of history. These days, the Winged Hussars only exist in myth and history books, in paintings and statues, and in memories. But the memory of their accomplishments is still powerful. They serve as a reminder that success is possible despite insurmountable obstacles, that numerical advantages can be overcome by courage, skill, and astute leadership.
Historical turning points frequently occur unexpectedly and in unexpected ways, and that heroes do occasionally, just occasionally, triumph over the seemingly unbeatable foe. One of the few occasions when everything was on the line, and the result of a single conflict actually affected the future of millions of people, was the Battle of Vienna. And that was the hidden weapon. When the fight was over, the smoke had cleared, and the sun had set over the field of blood. Poland's beautiful Winged Hussars triumphed, saving a whole culture as addition to a city. Over 3 centuries later, their accusation is still in place. Among the most amazing military achievements ever documented, the world was forever altered when history took a different turn in the amount of time it takes to ride a horse downhill. It is crucial to remember that this was a war of faith as much as a military conflict for the Christian soldiers who fought in Vienna. John Sobieski and his soldiers knelt in prayer before the last charge, pleading with the Lord God for protection. The king himself declared that he had come to defend Christianity in the name of the Lord God. Sobieski paraphrased Julius Caesar's remarks in a letter to the Pope following the triumph. "We arrived, we witnessed, and the Lord God triumphed on behalf of Vienna's liberators and defenders." The triumph was a manifestation of divine providence rather than merely the outcome of better strategies or equipment. In many Catholic nations, the day of the battle was proclaimed a religious feast, and churches all over Europe observed Thanksgiving. It is indisputable that these men's strong confidence in their cause and their belief that they were fighting under the Lord God's protection gave them great courage and commitment, regardless of their personal beliefs. The participants valued the spiritual side of the conflict just as much as the military ones, which explains why they fought so valiantly and persisted when it looked hopeless.